You are watching Hillsborough Television, programming that keeps you informed about the services and activities of your county government.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. I'm Bob Hunter, filling in for your host, Ray Shermonte. I'm Executive Director of the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. Today we're going to focus on fiscal impact of growth. That's a complicated subject. We're pleased to have as our guest Paul Tischler. His firm, Tischler & Associates, is located in Bethesda, Maryland. The firm focuses on fiscal evaluations and revenue sources related to growth. Mr. Tischler has worked on more than 300 fiscal impact evaluations throughout the country and has developed for local governments various revenue sources for both the public sector and the private sector. He's also worked on a number of impact fee assignments. He's in the area to help the Planning Commission consider whether we should do a fiscal impact analysis of growth. In other words, what are the benefits and what are the costs of growth or development in our community? Does growth pay its own way? If not, what are the alternatives? If it does, what are the impacts? Paul, to start off today, I'd like for you to give sort of an introduction as to your firm and really more succinct the types of work that we do here, or that you do there.
Well, Bob, what we do is focus on the fiscal analysis of development alternatives, whether it's comprehensive plan, sub-area plans, specific projects, or rezonings, as well as reinvestment. And we calculate what is the demand for services from that type of development and what are the resulting fiscal flows, whether it's a surplus or a deficit.
That's said very easily, and you know, if the citizens are watching, they're saying, how can we take such a complicated subject and reduce it down to dollars and cents? What types of subjects do you look at when you do this? And you know, here in Florida, we have to adopt a plan that requires us to have 6 subjects that has levels of service. Could you give us a little more on that?
Yeah, there are really 2 major components to a fiscal impact analysis. The first, which is really the healthy part in terms of getting citizens to better understand what are their possible development futures, is defining the scenarios. For example, in the county, you always have one scenario which can be fairly easily defined, and that's trends or a base case. How is the county likely to develop if there are no intervention strategies in terms of trying to change the way it's developing? That's what was normally called the base case or trends. Now, some folks and some policymakers might be interested in asking the question, well, what happens if we achieve a scenario which is more consistent or more at variation with the comprehensive plan that's on the books? That could be another scenario. A third one could be, what would happen if we have more compact development versus more dispersed development? Once that's defined, which is, as I say, is a very healthy exercise, because it's the first time that people will really see numbers put to housing units by type and population by type. I want to say population.
You go to that level of detail on housing types?
Yes, because a single-family housing unit is going to take up more land than a townhouse or an apartment unit, and it will also have different household characteristics, a different household size. And of course, there'll be, if you have more people in a unit, it's probably going to generate more services, but at the same time, a single family house is likely to generate higher property tax rates than a lower valued unit. So you have to look at that. But going to your question, I wanted to give you a preface of that, because knowing that type of information, you then go to the people who provide the services, that is the county departments, and you ask them the question, all right, if we have more population, more housing units, how does that affect your demand for services, and then what about the cost factors and revenue factors, and you use the current budget. So although it sounds complicated, if you're familiar with what you're doing, you can come up with good data which is understandable to all parties.
I understand. Well, I've followed your firm for a number of years, and I know you've been doing this for 25 to 30
That's
years.
Right.
But are more communities getting interested in this?
Yes, they are, because there's an increasing awareness of the citizens, current residents of many communities, that somehow our levels of service seem to be decreasing, and frequently that's in the form of more traffic congestion, overcrowded schools, sometimes slower response time from police, overcrowded parks, things like that. So they're asking the question, why is that? And a lot of times they quite frankly blame it on growth. And they say it's all growth's fault, and that's not necessarily true. There are other reasons why those things are happening, including just the level of service increases that we demand, not realizing how much it's going to cost us to have 5 fewer kids per class, or to have more park programs. And we want higher demands for service, but we don't want to pay more in property taxes, so you get these fiscal gaps.
Such as perhaps larger lot sizes, perhaps we all want a 3-minute police response time, and in Hillsborough County that would be difficult in some of the areas that we have. Same way with fire, I guess. I mean, I guess we all think that when we buy a house, all the services are going to be immediate in there.
Exactly, and in Hillsborough County is probably a good example of how you have a difference in urban services and non-urban services.
Good
I mean,
point.
If you have more dense development in Hillsborough County, it's obviously going to be easier to reach and serve those people there than if you have more of a leapfrog or more dispersed low-density development. An emergency medical service response is going to take longer to them.
And you're a little familiar with Hillsborough County, having been here in the past 3 days and doing these interviews, and you're familiar with this adopted urban service area that we have. Have you, tell us about urban service areas. Have you seen them in other communities, and sort of how do you compare, if you do this, comparing growth and costs of growth inside an urban service area compared to rural? I mean, that could get complicated too, couldn't it?
Yes. I think it's to the county's credit that they have an urban service area, because it gives some boundaries, gives you some understanding of where you can or should develop and where you shouldn't. Of course, then within the urban service area, the configurations of development can have an effect on the demands for services and the fiscal consequences. One of the problems that we see around the country is people who move into rural areas, or more rural areas within a jurisdiction even, larger jurisdiction. They come to demand and expect urban services. They are more likely to be moving from an area where more dense area where there are urban services to this more rural environment, and then all of a sudden they say, I thought we were buying these services when we moved here, even though the property tax rate was lower or whatever. And as the more people who move out there and join in that outcry, the more likely it is that they're going to be down and demanding these higher levels of service.
That's sort of what we're seeing here. Somebody has called those the Cappuccino Cowboys, who buy that 2 acres, and in some cases expect a 3-minute and 5-minute response time by fire and local neighborhood parks. And what we're trying to do is to look at, as I see this, providing urban services and rural services. I want the public to be aware also that you've also worked on representing the private sector as well as the public sector. Could you give us some idea there of your experience? I think that's important also.
Yes, we have. In fact, we've just finished a number of several jobs for private parties to look at show that annexation, for example, might make sense to a community given different development scenarios. And in Cape Cod, where they have the town meeting to vote on things, we looked at a rezoning for a developer to show to the town that the fiscal effects were positive for this particular town. So we have both the public and private sector experience that is, I think, beneficial. I think regardless of who the client is, you want to have all the assumptions on the table. There should be no hidden agendas, and you're really trying to find out what makes fiscal sense for all parties.
If you were to go into a more thorough evaluation, say in Hillsborough County, one thing is important is that the stakeholders are involved in this process. What process have you used before to make sure that people are very aware of how you're going about your research, so that there's, I'll use the term buy-in to the results, I guess?
We would usually call it a liaison committee, where you have public and private sector folks who participate in reviewing the development scenarios that you're looking at, the growth scenarios that you want to look at. Then number two, they would also review the level of service and cost and revenue factor document, which contains all of these public sector numbers that will be used, so that if they have questions or they think that maybe there's something that was not included, that can be addressed at that time. And when the final report comes out, of course, the fiscal findings of these different development scenarios, they are given a presentation and allowed to ask all sorts of good questions.
I think that's important in any community, hopefully here if we're able to do this. I'd like to go back to the issue and subject of level of service, because here in Hillsborough County we're experiencing tremendous traffic problems. And I think it's very difficult for some people to understand level of service as it deals with roads. And we by state law are required to adopt a level of service concerning roads, but can you give an example of perhaps a big difference between one adopted level of service and the other, and how that relates to a cost that perhaps the public could better visualize, that if they want better traffic, what's the give and take on there?
As I mentioned before, transportation is clearly one of the most visible problems that you can see as there's more development. And there are two parts to that. First is, statistically, in national basis as well as regional basis, all of us, all the folks currently here, are partly responsible for this problem, because there are more cars per capita, there are more trips per car, and so you might not have any growth, and you'd still have this mushrooming of traffic on the roads. And so it's important for people to realize that. It's also important that there had been less dollars for roads in the past 5 to 10 years than there were previously, that were either federal or state. So the localities have had to come up with more money from where, that has to be creative. But the level of service is, if you had a level of service E, which is probably the worst, versus level of service A. Level of service E means that you're going to allow more congestion than you would under A. Now, the normal levels in the communities, urban communities, are C, D, and E. And if you want to raise your level of service, obviously, you're going to have to spend millions of dollars to do that, and it's very difficult. So what communities like Hillsborough County are now thinking about are how to get people into out of single occupancy vehicles into HOV, as they call them, more than one person in the vehicle, and maybe more transit, etc. And that is, of course, a factor in everybody who's looking at this show. How long does it take them to get where they're going? And there are just a lot more people, and each person's driving more than they used to.
Looking at this very complicated subject, I'm going to throw another question to you. We have Hillsborough County, but we also have a lot of people that live in surrounding counties that come into Hillsborough County that we say, and true, are clogging our roads. Is there a way that you would factor in that situation too?
Well, certainly to the extent, if one were to do a fiscal analysis on Hillsborough County's budget and the impact of it, you would be looking at the county roads. Now, a lot of the problem here is the interstate, federal and state roads, and there's less control that you have over that. So, but it's something that we would want to consider.
I know you're doing a lot of work in the state of Florida. Would you explain the types of work and who you're working for, if you don't mind, sort of, so we get a broader view of our local situation?
Well, we're working right now for Hernando County, Polk County, Sarasota County in this area of the state.
Okay.
And they relate to economic development questions, fiscal analysis issues, as well as impact fees.
So more local communities, even in the state, I'm assuming because of the Growth Management Act and making local communities look at costs and how they're going to pay for them, are starting to look at your type of service.
That's right. I think more and more communities and the citizens are aware that you should be able to, you want to be able to calculate, is the type of development we are having or encouraging paying its own way. To the extent it's not paying its own way, then there are 4 choices a community has, the citizens have, taxpayers have. That is, you can decide to raise revenues to make new growth generate its own fiscal neutrality. And these could be in combination. Number 2, you could reduce levels of service and expenditures.
Certainly.
Number 3 is you evaluate planning issues like staging of development, spatial distribution, local incentives and disincentives. And if you don't want to do any of those, then the 4th happens, and that is to balance your books, the level of service decreases and your expenses, in essence, decrease somewhat for all the people here today. And the levels of service will worsen unless you address these issues.
To use an old planner's term, but our quality of life starts decreasing, I guess.
That's correct.
We haven't discussed schools, but do you at times or normally include the issue of schools? That's a very important subject here in Hillsborough.
Yes, and we do that. It is very important, and location is very important in terms of busing and things like that as far as where new development goes.
As you look at the various subjects looking at levels of service, is there any 1 or 2 that pop out as the major issues concerning growth in a community?
Well, certainly transportation and schools are very big cost items. I think an important part of looking at the total equation, 2 parts are, 1, the land use, where is what's the location of different types of land use, and the second is the awareness of people that a lot of the fiscal problems today are because there are what are unfunded mandates where the federal and state governments have said, you county have to do this, provide this service, but oh, by the way, we're not giving you any money. And in fact, money has, the amount of federal and state monies to utilities and things like that has decreased dramatically, which has created this problem fiscally.
Well, we're even starting to see it from the state level too, whereas they're capping our ability in some instances to be able to generate some revenue, and others we do have local opportunities. Do you have an idea of when you might finish your evaluation here in Hillsborough County concerning the interest, and when you might present that final report?
I would say probably by about the end of August that we would be finished.
Okay, I know that you've been interviewing about 20 to 30 people. I bet those have been interesting.
It has been interesting, and it's also been interesting that there's been pretty much a consensus about on many of the issues.
Probably that we need to do it because that's our biggest argument or concern or discussion.
Yeah, I mean that there is, the people see the benefit of it, and they think that let's put the facts on the table, and then we can have more educated discussions about whether growth is good, certain types of growth are good, and who's paying.
Paul, I'm going to have to end this, but I really want to thank you for coming, and I would ask you to let us know if you have any comments about today's show, and you can reach us on our hotline or our email. And again, I'm Bob Hunter on behalf of the Planning Commission. Thank you for thinking beyond today. I thought that was